The Wyoming Territory in 1873 was no place for a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, but Jonah Mackenzie had nowhere else to go. His homestead sat like a lonely sentinel against the endless prairie, 20 miles from the nearest settlement of Cedar Falls. The cabin he had built with his own hands now felt more like a tomb than a home. It had been 14 months since the fever took his wife Sarah, and 6-year-old Anna had not spoken a word since they lowered her mother into the hard, unforgiving earth. The child moved through their home like a ghost, her large blue eyes absorbing everything but reflecting nothing back. Jonah watched her fade a little more each day, and the sight carved deeper hollows in his already broken heart. The work never stopped on a frontier homestead. Cattle needed tending, fences required mending, and the harsh Wyoming winters demanded constant preparation. But Jonah had let everything slide into disrepair. The barn door hung crooked on broken hinges. Weeds choked his once proud vegetable garden, and inside the cabin, dust settled like snow on every surface. Dirty dishes piled high in the wash basin, and the air grew thick with the stale scent of neglect. He had become a man of few words, and grief had stolen most of those. The neighboring ranchers had tried to help at first, bringing casseroles and offering assistance, but Jonah's cold silences eventually drove them away. Only the men from the railroad camp still visited, and their visits were never welcome. Thomas Harker led that rough crew, a man with cruel eyes and a laugh like breaking glass. He had been sniffing around Jonah's land for months, making offers that sounded more like threats. The railroad wanted a right-of-way through Jonah's property, and Harker made it clear that one way or another, they would have it. "A man alone out here," Harker had said during his last visit, his eyes lingering on little Anna. "Well, that ain't natural. Accidents happen. Equipment fails. Sometimes a man needs to know when he's beat." But Jonah was not ready to surrender. This land held every memory of Sarah, every dream they had shared. The cabin still held the echo of her laughter, and her favorite wildflowers still bloomed near the porch she had loved. He would not abandon the only home Anna had ever known, even if keeping it meant facing whatever cruel game Harker was planning. The warning signs had been subtle at first. Cattle went missing. Tools disappeared from the barn. The well water turned muddy after heavy rains, though it had always run clear before. Jonah knew these were not coincidences, but he had no proof. And in a territory where justice was sparse and sheriffs were bought and paid for, proof was everything. As the sun set behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the desolate prairie, Jonah stood on his porch and watched the horizon. Anna sat beside him in silence, her small hand resting in his large, calloused palm. The wind carried the scent of sage and the distant promise of winter. He had no idea that this evening would change everything. That fate was riding toward them across the darkening plains, wearing the face of cruelty, but carrying the seeds of redemption. The sound of approaching horses broke the evening stillness, and Jonah felt his jaw tighten. Harker and his men were coming, and their laughter already rang across the distance like the call of coyotes sensing wounded prey. They came with the dying light, 5 riders silhouetted against the blood-red sky. Thomas Harker led them, sitting tall in his saddle with the confidence of a man who had never met consequences he could not buy his way out of. Behind him rode his crew from the railroad camp, rough men with hard faces and harder hearts, the kind who did their boss's dirty work without asking questions. But tonight, they brought something different. Tied across the saddle of Harker's horse was a small figure, bound and gagged, barely visible in the gathering dusk. As they drew closer, Jonah could see it was a woman, Asian by her features, her dark hair hanging loose around a face pale with exhaustion and fear. "Evening, Mackenzie," Harker called out, his voice carrying that familiar mocking tone. "Brought you something special. Call it a neighborly gesture." The men dismounted with deliberate slowness, their spurs jingling like tiny bells in the still air. They hauled the woman down from the horse, and she stumbled, barely keeping her feet. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her hands bound with rough rope that had rubbed her wrists raw. Found her wandering near the railroad camp, Harker continued, his eyes never leaving Jonah's face. Poor little thing got separated from one of the work crews heading west. Figured a man like you, all alone out here with that girl of yours, might appreciate some company. The other men laughed, a sound like glass breaking on stone. Jonah felt Anna's hand tighten in his, felt her shrink back against his leg. He kept his face carefully neutral, knowing that any reaction would only fuel their cruel amusement. Ain't she pretty? One of the men jeered. Like a little china doll. Real decorative. Course, if you don't want her, Harker said, pretending to consider, there's always the mining camp up north. Heard they pay good money for entertainment. The woman's eyes met Jonah's across the darkening yard. Even in the fading light, he could see the terror there, but also something else. A flicker of desperate hope, like the last ember in a dying fire. She had understood enough English to know what these men were suggesting, and her fate if Jonah turned her away. What do you say, Mackenzie? Harker pressed. Seem ungrateful to refuse such a generous gift. Jonah felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. These men had brought this woman here not out of kindness, but as another twist of the knife they had been turning in his heart for months. They expected him to refuse, to send her away, proving to themselves that he was exactly the cold, heartless man they believed him to be. Or perhaps they expected him to accept, giving them ammunition for gossip that would spread through the territory like wildfire. Either way, it was a trap. The woman swayed on her feet, and Jonah saw how thin she was, how the bones of her wrists showed sharp beneath her skin. She had been starved, abused, treated worse than livestock. Looking at her, he saw not the cruel joke Harker intended, but a fellow human being stripped of everything except a stubborn will to survive. Please, she whispered, the word barely audible in the evening air. Her English was broken, heavily accented, but the desperation in her voice needed no translation. Just for tonight. It was not really a question, more a prayer offered to a God she was not sure was listening. In that moment, Jonah saw past the careful cruelty of Harker's game. This woman's life hung in the balance of his decision, and whatever else he had become, his grief. He was not a man who could knowingly send another human being to their destruction. Without a word, he jerked his head toward the barn. The gesture was brusque, almost angry, but the woman's face crumpled with relief so profound it was painful to witness. Well, Harker said, his voice dripping with false surprise. The hermit has a heart after all. Don't say we never did you any favors, Mackenzie. The men remounted their horses, their laughter echoing across the prairie as they rode away into the gathering darkness. Jonah stood on his porch, watching their shadows disappear, knowing that this was just the beginning of whatever game they were playing. The woman had not spoken again after her desperate plea, but she moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. Jonah watched from his kitchen window as she disappeared into the shadows of the barn, her small figure swallowed by the darkness dot inside the cabin. The silence felt different. Anna had retreated to her corner, but instead of staring blankly at the wall as she usually did, her eyes were fixed on the window facing the barn. For the first time in months, curiosity flickered across her young features. Sleep came hard for Jonah that night. Every creak of the wind-battered cabin, every settling timber, made him wonder if Harker's men had returned. He lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the prairie night. Somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called to each other, their voices lonely and wild. When morning came, creeping gray and cold through the grimy windows, Jonah found something that stopped him in his tracks. On the rough-hewn table, a clean space had been cleared. A bowl of warm porridge, made from his dwindling stores, steamed gently beside his tin cup, which had been scrubbed clean for the first time in months. He looked around the kitchen with new eyes. The floor had been swept. The jumble of pots and pans had been arranged with an order that spoke of careful hands and practiced efficiency. On a hook by the door, his heavy work coat hung where he had left it, but the long, jagged tear in the sleeve had been mended with tiny, nearly invisible stitches. She had moved through his home like a ghost, bringing order to chaos while he slept. It was not charity, but something else entirely. A transaction, perhaps. A demonstration of worth. The message was clear. I am not a burden. He found her by the woodpile, a small frame methodically stacking logs with a precision that defied her apparent fragility. She worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that survival depended on making herself indispensable. When she sensed his presence, she did not look up, but her movements became even more deliberate. This was her language, Jonah realized. Not words, but work. The swept floor was a statement. The mended coat was a promise. The warm breakfast was proof that she could contribute, that she deserved the shelter he had grudgingly provided. He understood this silent negotiation far better than he would have understood tears or pleas. This was the arithmetic of frontier survival, where every person had to earn their place through competence and contribution. She was offering her skills in exchange for sanctuary, and Jonah found himself respecting the directness of the arrangement. But respect was one thing, and trust was another entirely. Word would spread quickly through the territory about Harker's gift. The men would be watching, waiting to see how long the grieving hermit would keep his exotic houseguest. Some would come out of curiosity, others with darker intentions. The woman, he realized he did not even know her name, was a walking target. Every day she remained on his property increased the danger for all of them. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to send her away before the situation became more complicated. Yet, as he watched her work, saw the quiet dignity in her movements despite everything she had endured, Jonah found himself thinking not of the risks, but of the changes he had already noticed. The house felt less like a tomb. Anna had eaten the porridge without being coaxed, her eyes bright with an interest he had not seen in months. Perhaps, he thought, one more day would not hurt. The wind was sharp, and the work was endless. He could use the help, and she clearly needed the shelter. Just until he could figure out what to do next. He had no idea that across the territory, Thomas Harker was already planning his next move. The cruel joke had taken an unexpected turn, and men like Harker did not appreciate having their carefully laid plans disrupted. If Jonah Mackenzie thought he could accept their gift and live peacefully, he was about to learn otherwise. Word traveled fast in the sparse settlements of Wyoming Territory, carried by traders, drifters, and anyone with a horse and a tendency to gossip. Within a week, everyone from Cedar Falls to the mining camps knew that the hermit Mackenzie had taken in the Chinese woman. The stories grew in the telling, each version more scandalous than the last. May. That was her name. She had finally whispered it to Anna while teaching her to fold cloth into tiny flowers moved through the homestead with increasing confidence. She had planted a small garden of hardy herbs near the cabin, coaxing life from the stubborn soil with the same patience she showed in all things. Anna followed her everywhere, a silent shadow gradually warming to the gentle presence that asked nothing but gave everything. Jonah watched it all, from his self-imposed distance, fighting a war within himself. Part of him resented this intrusion, this disruption of his carefully maintained grief. The sound of May's humming, the sight of Anna's tentative smiles, they felt like betrayals of Sarah's memory. But another part of him, a part he thought had died with his wife, felt a desperate gratitude for the life slowly returning to his home. The confrontation came on a blistering hot afternoon in late July. Harker arrived with twice as many men as before, their faces grim with purpose. They rode into the yard like an occupying army, dust rising from their horses' hooves like smoke from a battlefield. "Mackenzie!" Harker bellowed, not bothering to dismount. "Time to talk business." Jonah emerged from the barn, his hands still dirty from repairing a harness. Behind him, May appeared in the cabin doorway, Anna clutching her skirt with both hands. The child's eyes were wide with the instinctive fear of prey, animals sensing predators. "Heard you've grown mighty attached to our little gift," Harker continued, his voice carrying across the yard. "Shame, that. See, we've had some complaints from decent folk. Seems they don't much like the idea of a white man keeping a heathen woman under his roof, especially with an impressionable child in the house." The accusations hung in the air like poison. Jonah felt his hands clench into fists, but he forced himself to remain still. This was exactly what Harker wanted: a reaction, preferably a violent one that would justify whatever came next. "Now, I'm a reasonable man," Harker said, though his smile suggested otherwise. "I'm willing to overlook this temporary lapse in judgment. Hell, we all get lonely. But it's time to set things right. The woman needs to go. Tonight." "Where?" Jonah asked, his voice level despite the rage building in his chest. Harker's grin widened. "Oh, don't you worry about that. I've got buyers lined up at the mining camp. She earned her keep, one way or another." Behind him, Jonah heard May's sharp intake of breath. Anna made a small, frightened sound, the first sound she had made in response to anything in over a year. The child had been abandoned once by death. She would not willingly let go of the woman who had brought warmth back to their cold world. "And if I refuse?" Jonah asked. "Well now," Harker said, settling back in his saddle, "that would be unfortunate. See, harboring stolen property is a serious crime in these parts. And this woman, well, she belongs to the railroad company. Contract labor, you might say. Taking her in makes you a thief." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But in a territory where the law was whatever men like Harker decided it should be, the truth mattered less than power. And Harker had all the power, the men, the guns, the backing of the railroad company that wanted Jonah's land. "You've got until sunset," Harker said, turning his horse toward the gate. "After that, we come back for what's ours. And we might not be so particular about what else we take with us." The threat was clear. Refuse to give up May, and Anna might disappear as well. It was the perfect trap, using Jonah's love for his daughter as leverage to force his compliance. As the riders disappeared in a cloud of dust, Jonah stood in his yard and felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. Inside the cabin, he could hear Anna crying not the silent tears she had shed for her mother, but great, racking sobs that seemed to tear themselves from her small body. May knelt beside the child, speaking to her in soft, broken English mixed with words from her own language. The sound of it, the desperate tenderness in her voice as she tried to comfort the little girl who had become her whole world, broke something fundamental in Jonah's chest. He had been prepared to lose May. She was, after all, a temporary refuge in their lives, a brief respite from the isolation that had consumed them. But seeing Anna's anguish, understanding that his daughter was about to lose another woman she had learned to love, Jonah realized that some choices were no choices at all. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon. In a few hours, Harker would return, and everything would change. But perhaps, Jonah thought as he walked toward his gun cabinet, it was time for the change to surprise everyone. The rifle felt foreign in Jonah's hands. Not because he was unfamiliar with weapons. Every man on the frontier knew how to shoot, but because he had not held one with the intent to use it since the day Sarah died. For over a year, he had been running from confrontation, avoiding conflict, letting the world push him deeper into his isolated grief. But watching Anna sob in May's arms, seeing the terror in the Chinese woman's eyes as she faced a return to the hell she had escaped, Something hardened in Jonah's chest. He had failed to protect Sarah from the fever, but he would not fail to protect these two souls who had brought life back to his dying home. However, charging out with a rifle blazing would only get them all killed. Harker had too many men, and they were professionals at violence. Jonah needed something more powerful than bullets. He needed the law. "May," he said quietly, kneeling beside her and Anna, "what you told those men about being contract labor, is any of that true?" She looked up at him, confusion and fear warring in her dark eyes. "Contract?" she repeated, the English word clumsy on her tongue. "Papers," Jonah explained, mimicking writing. "Did anyone make you sign papers? Bind you to work?" Understanding dawned on her face, followed quickly by a shake of her head. "No papers. No contract. They take me from family farm after flood. Say I owe money for food, for place to sleep. But no papers." Jonah felt a grim smile tug at the corner of his mouth. Harker had made a crucial mistake in his arrogance. Contract labor was legal in the territories, but only with proper documentation. Without papers, May was not property. She was a free woman being held against her will. "Anna," he said gently, and his daughter looked up at him with tear-streaked cheeks. "I need you to be brave for me, sweetheart. Can you do that?" The little girl nodded, though her grip on May's hand did not loosen. Jonah stood and walked to the old wooden chest where Sarah used to keep her sewing. Beneath the faded fabrics and tangled threads, he found what he was looking for: the deed to his property, and more importantly, the territorial legal code that the circuit judge had left behind during his last visit. For the next 2 hours, as the sun crept steadily toward the horizon, Jonah read. He had always been better with his hands than with books, but desperation made him focused. He studied the sections on property rights, personal liberty, and the legal requirements for binding labor contracts stopped by the time Harker's men appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the setting sun like harbingers of doom. Jonah was ready. "May," he said quietly, "I need you and Anna to stay inside. No matter what happens, do not come out until I call for you." He stepped onto his porch, the territorial legal code tucked under one arm, his rifle resting against the doorframe within easy reach. As Harker and his men rode into the yard, their faces hard with anticipated triumph, Jonah felt the calm that comes before a storm. "Well, Mackenzie," Harker called out, "I see you've come to your senses. Where's the woman?" "She's exactly where she belongs," Jonah replied evenly. "On my property, under my protection." Harker's face darkened. "Now see here, you stubborn fool. I warned you what would happen if you didn't cooperate, and I've been doing some reading," Jonah said, holding up the legal code. "Interesting thing about territorial law. Contract labor requires proper documentation, filed with the territorial courthouse. Without it, what you're describing is slavery. And slavery, Mr. Harker, was abolished by federal law." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Several of Harker's men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. These were rough men, but they were not stupid. Even in the lawless territories, there were lines that, once crossed, brought federal attention no one wanted. "You calling me a liar, Mackenzie?" Harker's hand drifted toward his gun. "I'm calling you a man who made a mistake," Jonah replied calmly. "And now you're trying to compound that mistake with kidnapping and theft. Both federal crimes." For the first time since this confrontation began, doubt flickered across Harker's face. He had been so focused on his land grab, so confident in his ability to intimidate a grieving hermit, that he had not considered the legal implications of his actions. "Course," Jonah continued conversationally, "if you've got papers proving your claim, I'd be happy to take a look. Otherwise, I suggest you ride away and pretend this conversation never happened." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Behind Harker, his men waited for orders that did not come. Their leader was caught between his arrogance and his suddenly uncertain legal position, and the delay cost him the initiative he had counted on. "This ain't over, Mackenzie," Harker finally growled, but the threat sounded hollow compared to his earlier confidence. "No," Jonah agreed quietly. "It's not. But the next move is yours to make. Choose carefully." 3 days later, Circuit Judge Samuel Harrison arrived in Cedar Falls for his monthly court session, and Jonah was waiting for him. Word had already reached the judge about the confrontation at the Mackenzie homestead inn, a territory where news traveled faster than wildfire. Such incidents were impossible to keep quiet. Judge Harrison was a fair man, but he was also practical. He knew that maintaining order in the territories required balancing the letter of the law with the realities of frontier life. When Jonah requested a formal hearing, the judge agreed, though he warned that such proceedings could have far-reaching consequences. The hearing was set for the following Saturday in Cedar Falls' only church, the largest building in the settlement. By dawn that morning, it seemed half the territory had arrived to witness what many were calling the trial of the hermit and his heathen woman. Jonah arrived with May and Anna, their small wagon drawing stares and whispers from the crowd. May wore Sarah's best dress, carefully altered to fit her smaller frame, her black hair pulled back in a simple but dignified style. Anna sat between them, her small hand clasped firmly in May's, her face solemn with the gravity of the moment. Thomas Harker arrived with an entourage of his own, his railroad crew, a ladder from Cheyenne, and several prominent citizens who had business interests tied to the railroad expansion. He projected confidence, but Jonah could see the tension in the man's shoulders, the way his eyes never quite settled anywhere for long. Judge Harrison called the assembly to order, with the gravity befitting a federal proceeding. "This hearing," he announced, "has been called to determine the legal status of one May Chun, recently arrived in our territory under disputed circumstances. Mr. Harker, you have claimed this woman is bound to you by legal contract. Please present your evidence." Harker's lawyer, a thin man with nervous eyes, stood and shuffled through his papers. "Your Honor, my client acquired this woman as part of a group of contract laborers intended for railroad construction. While the original documents were lost in transit, the customary practice clearly establishes his legal right to her services." "Customary practice," Judge Harrison repeated dryly, "is not law, counselor. Do you have documentation or not?" The lawyer's face reddened. "The circumstances of frontier commerce sometimes require yes or no, counselor." A long pause. "No, Your Honor, not specific to this individual." A murmur ran through the crowd. Without documentation, Harker's claim had no legal foundation, and everyone present understood the implications. Judge Harrison turned to May. "Miss Chun, do you speak English well enough to understand these proceedings?" May stood, her voice clear despite her accent. "I understand, Your Honor. Did you ever sign papers agreeing to work for Mr. Harker or his associates?" "No papers, Your Honor. They take me after flood, destroy my family farm. Say I owe them for food, for shelter, but I never agree to nothing. They keep me like ... double quote." She paused, searching for the word. "Like animal. And how did you come to be at Mr. Mackenzie's property?" May's eyes flickered to Jonah before returning to the judge. "Men bring me there at night. Say I'm gift for lonely man. They laugh, make jokes about what I am for. I very scared." Her honest testimony cut through the courtroom like a blade. Even Harker's supporters shifted uncomfortably as the reality of the situation became clear. "Mr. Mackenzie," Judge Harrison continued, "what is your relationship to Miss Chun?" Jonah stood, his voice steady and clear. "She asked for shelter for one night, Your Honor. I provided it. She has since contributed to the welfare of my household and the care of my daughter through her own free choice. I consider her a member of my family. By what right do you claim this relationship?" "By the right of human decency, Your Honor, and by territorial law." which grants any free person the right to choose their own circumstances and associations. Judge Harrison consulted his law books, though Jonah suspected the man already knew what he would find. The legal precedents were clear, even if the social customs were not. "Mr. Harker," the judge said finally, "you have presented no legal evidence to support your claim of ownership over Miss Chen. Furthermore, your actions in forcibly detaining and transporting her against her will constitute kidnapping under federal law. Miss Chen, you are hereby declared a free resident of Wyoming Territory, with all the rights and protections afforded under territorial and federal law." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and angry shouts. Harker's face went white with rage, his carefully laid plans crumbling around him. But Judge Harrison was not finished. Furthermore, he continued, raising his voice above the commotion, "I am ordering a federal investigation into labor practices at the railroad camps. If evidence of illegal detention or forced labor is found, those responsible will face the full weight of federal justice." It was more than a legal victory. It was a complete demolition of Harker's power structure. The man who had terrorized the territory through intimidation and illegal practices now faced federal scrutiny that could destroy everything he had built. Thomas Harker did not take defeat gracefully. 3 weeks after the hearing, as autumn painted the Wyoming hills in gold and crimson, he made one last desperate play for revenge. This time he came alone, riding hard toward the Mackenzie homestead with the fury of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. The federal investigators had indeed found evidence of forced labor at the railroad camps, and Harker was facing charges that would likely see him imprisoned for years. His business empire was crumbling, his political connections had abandoned him, and his reputation lay in ruins. But before the federal marshals could arrest him, he had unfinished business with the man who had caused his downfall. Jonah was working on the roof of the cabin, replacing shingles damaged by the early storms, when he saw the rider approaching at a gallop. Even at a distance, he recognized Harker's distinctive silhouette, and the way the man rode spoke of deadly purpose. "May." Jonah called down to where she was hanging laundry in the yard. "Take Anna inside, now." Something in his tone made her drop the wet sheet she was holding and run for the cabin without question. Anna, playing with a cornhusk doll May had made her, looked up in confusion as she was swept up and carried indoors. Jonah climbed down from the roof and walked to where his rifle leaned against the porch railing. He checked the load, then stood waiting as Harker thundered into the yard, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. The man who dismounted was barely recognizable as the confident railroad boss who had once terrorized the territory. Harker's clothes were rumpled and stained, his face unshaven and wild-eyed with the desperation of a cornered animal. But the gun in his hand was steady enough. "You destroyed me, Mackenzie," Harker snarled, advancing across the yard. "Everything I built, everything I worked for. Gone because you couldn't mind your own business. You destroyed yourself." Jonah replied calmly, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed. "I just stopped letting you destroy others." High and mighty words from a man who took another man's woman. Harker spat. "You think you're better than me? You're just a lonely fool who fell for the first fawn whore who smiled at him." Jonah felt anger flash through him, but he kept his voice level. "She's not your woman or any man's property. She's a free person who chose where she wanted to be. Free?" Harker laughed bitterly. "Nothing's free out here, Mackenzie. Everything costs something, and you're about to pay the full price for your righteousness." He raised his gun, and for a moment, the two men faced each other across the dusty yard like characters from an Old Testament judgment. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between them, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out as it circled overhead. But before either man could pull a trigger, the cabin door opened, and Anna stepped onto the porch. "Papa," she said, her clear young voice cutting through the tension like a bell. It was the first word she had spoken since her mother's death. and it stopped both men dead in their tracks. Behind Anna, May appeared in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. She did not try to pull the child back inside. Instead, she placed a gentle hand on Anna's shoulder and stood with her. Two figures framed by the cabin's rough-hewn logs. "Please don't hurt my papa," Anna continued, her words coming slowly but clearly. "We need him. All of us need him." The simple innocence of the child's plea seemed to drain the madness from Harker's eyes. He looked at Anna, then at May, then at Jonah, and something fundamental shifted in his expression. Perhaps he saw what Jonah had seen that first night, not a cruel joke or a piece of property, but a human being deserving of dignity and protection. Or perhaps he simply realized that killing a man in front of his 6-year-old daughter was a line even he could not cross. Slowly, Harker lowered his gun. His shoulders sagged as the weight of his defeat finally settled upon him. "Federal marshals are probably already looking for me," he said quietly, almost to himself. No point in making things worse. He holstered his weapon and looked at Jonah one last time. "You won, Mackenzie. I hope you're satisfied with what it cost." "The only cost was justice," Jonah replied. "And that was a price worth paying." Harker mounted his horse without another word and rode away, disappearing into the golden afternoon light. Jonah watched until he was gone, then set down his rifle and walked to the porch where his daughter and May waited. Anna ran to him, throwing her small arms around his waist. "I was scared you would go away like Mama did," she whispered against his shirt. Jonah knelt and gathered her into his arms, his eyes meeting May's over the child's head. In that look passed understanding, gratitude, and something deeper, the recognition that they had fought for each other and won something more precious than land or money or pride. They had won the right to be a family. Spring returned to Wyoming territory with unusual gentleness that year, as if the land itself was celebrating the peace that had finally come to the Mackenzie homestead. The harsh winds that had scoured the plains for months gave way to soft breezes that carried the scent of prairie flowers and new grass. Jonah stood on his porch in the early morning light, watching May teach Anna to plant seeds in the expanded garden they had prepared together. The sight filled him with a contentment he had not felt since Sarah's death, not the same happiness he had known with his first wife, but a different kind of peace, deeper and perhaps more precious for having been earned through suffering. The changes in their lives had been profound but gradual, like the slow turning of seasons. Anna, who had been silent for over a year, now chattered constantly, switching between English and the Chinese words May taught her. A laughter rang across the yard as she discovered earthworms in the rich soil, and the sound was like music to Jonah's ears that May had blossomed as well, her initial wariness replaced by quiet confidence. She had proven herself indispensable, not just as a housekeeper, but as a partner in the endless work of frontier life. She could mend harnesses as skillfully as she mended clothes, could coax vegetables from stubborn soil, and could calm a frightened horse with the same gentle patience she showed Anna. But more than that, she had brought something back to the homestead that Jonah had thought was lost forever. Hope. Not just the hope for survival, but the hope for growth, for happiness, for a future worth building. The legal resolution of their troubles had taken months to fully unfold. Thomas Harker had been arrested by federal marshals 2 days after his final confrontation with Jonah, found hiding in a cave 20 miles north of Cedar Falls. The charges against him were extensive: kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy to defraud the government, and a dozen other federal crimes that would keep him in prison for the rest of his natural life. The railroad company, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, had abandoned their plans for a right-of-way through Jonah's property. Instead, they offered to purchase a small strip of his land at a fair price for a spur line that would actually benefit the local ranchers. Jonah accepted the offer, using the money to improve his homestead and secure his family's future. But the most significant change was not in their circumstances, but in their hearts. What had begun as a desperate arrangement between strangers had grown into something neither of them had dared to hope for. Genuine love that it had not happened quickly or easily. Both Jonah and May carried scars from their past losses, and trust had to be built slowly, like a bridge constructed stone by careful stone. There had been long evenings of tentative conversation, shared silences that spoke louder than words, and gradual recognition that they had found in each other not just companionship, but partnership. The proposal, when it finally came, was as practical and honest as everything else between them. They were sitting on the porch after Anna had gone to sleep, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. "May," Jonah said quietly, "I've been thinking about our situation." She turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight from the cabin. "What kind of thinking?" "The kind that says what we have here is worth making permanent," he replied. "Not because either of us needs saving anymore, but because we've built something good together. Something worth protecting." She was quiet for a long moment, and Jonah felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Then she smiled, the same gentle smile that had begun to heal his broken world. "I think the same thing," she said simply. "Anna needs a mother. You need a partner. I need a home. But more than need, I want this. I want us." They were married in the same church where Judge Harrison had declared May's freedom, with Anna as their solemn witness and half the territory in attendance. It was not a grand affair. May wore Sarah's wedding dress, carefully altered, and Jonah wore his best suit, brushed clean and mended where necessary. But as they spoke their vows in voices steady with conviction, as Anna scattered wildflower petals at their feet, and as the congregation witnessed the union of three souls who had found wholeness in each other, it felt like the most important ceremony ever held in that simple frontier church. Now, 6 months later, as Jonah watched his wife teach his daughter to plant beans in rows as straight as soldiers, he marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. May was no longer the terrified woman who had been dumped on his porch like a cruel joke. She was his partner, his equal, his home. Anna looked up from her planting and waved at him, her face bright with happiness. "Papa, come see how straight my rows are." Jonah walked over to inspect her work, noting the careful precision that reflected May's patient teaching. "Very impressive, sweetheart. Your mother would be proud." It was the first time he had referred to May as Anna's mother in the child's presence, and both females stopped their work to look at him. Anna's face lit up with joy, while May's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "She is my mama," Anna said matter-of-factly, as if stating an obvious truth. The mama who stayed. May knelt and gathered the little girl into her arms, and Jonah saw in that embrace the final piece of their family's healing. They had all been broken in different ways by death, by cruelty, by circumstances beyond their control. But they had found in each other the strength to rebuild, to grow, to become something new and beautiful. As the sun climbed higher in the clear Wyoming sky, Jonah Mackenzie stood in his garden with his wife and daughter and felt the deep satisfaction of a man who had learned that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the cruelest jokes. They had received May as a taunt, a reminder of their isolation and loss. Instead, she had become their salvation, their bridge back to the world of the living, their proof that love could grow in even the most barren soil if it was tended with patience and watered with hope. The homestead that had once been a monument to grief was now a testament to the resilience of the human heart. And in the garden where a Chinese woman taught a frontier child to coax life from the earth, the future was taking root, one seed at a time. In years to come, when Anna grew up and had children of her own, she would tell them the story of how her father received her mother as a gift from cruel men who thought they were delivering a joke. She would tell them how love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, how families could be forged not just by blood, but by choice, and how sometimes the greatest strength was found not in fighting against the storms of life, but in opening your door to the strangers they blew onto your porch and on quiet evenings, when the Wyoming winds sang through the prairie grass and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The ghost of that long-ago cruelty would seem less real than the laughter of children playing in a garden planted by their mother's gentle hands, in soil made rich by their father's honest labor, in a home built on the bedrock of love freely given and gratefully received.